to the Hueneme Museum. Beverly will be introducing our famous speaker in a few moments. What I want to do is to mention to anyone that's interested that we do lighthouse tours, and after today, the next one would be July 20th. Will be the next one, July 20th. And then we do a port tours, which we do every third Friday. And third Friday of each month, third Friday. And that goes out here at 10 o'clock. That's really worth it because the port sends somebody over that really knows what's going on, so you get an interesting tour. Another thing is next weekend is Memorial Day, which we'll have a Memorial Day ceremony that will, program starts at 8:30, but between 8 and 8:30, the Hueneme High School Band will be playing marching music or whatever they choose to start off with. Patriotic music. And the program usually lasts probably about 55 minutes at the most. It goes pretty quickly. It'll be in front of City Hall on Ventura Road. And the program, like I say, starts at 8:30. And then the following Saturday, which is the 1st of June, we're going to have Bridge Carney talk on PT 157. He did this a couple of years ago, and he brings in a full-scale model of the PT boat.
Which is the one,
Pardon me?
which is the PT boat that rescued
JFK.
Oh my goodness.
So his talk is very, very interesting. And so it'll be, if anybody wants to come, it'll be on the 1st. So now I'd introduce Beverly Kelly, who was just given the Citizen of the Year for Hueneme.
Yay!
Thank you. This is our speaker today. I'm very excited about it because he agreed to arrive in costume, and I know this is it's wool, right? It's really heavy and it's hot, so we won't make him wear it much longer. Jose Ignacio Rivera, he is Apache,
Nahuatl.
Nahuatl, and
Huasteco.
Vasqueros. I knew I messed each one of those up. And he's the former director of the Heritage Center at the Red Cloud Indian School and on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in South Dakota. But that's not all. He's also the director of was the director of education in the Marin Museum of the American Indian in Novato, California. Curator of exhibits at Heritage Square in downtown Phoenix, going back to Arizona, and a retired California State Park Ranger and peace officer, which I'm sure is a story in itself. He holds an AA in archaeosophy, which I've never heard of before, but it sounds fascinating. It's ancient history, ancient philosophy, and symbolic art. And that's from CSU University. He also has a BS in Native American Studies from the University of California at Davis, and an MA in History and Historical Resources Management from the University of California at Riverside. But he's also now a PhD candidate at the University of California at Berkeley. So, you know, doctor. Okay. With that, I give you our speech.
First of all, I want to thank you for coming. And before I actually start my formal presentation, this is the traditional dress of a vaquero, or cow in Spanish is un vaca. A vaquero would be a cattleman. And this would be the traditional dress minus the microphone. And I was wearing this lately, but I had to take it off because it was so warm. They wore the traditional waistcoat with cotton lining inside. This was traditional. Cotton lining inside, wool outside. I'm gonna go right up here. Now, they wore soft leather shoes. And these are called botas de ala, meaning winged boots. And they wrap around, and here they're being held by a horsehair tie. Now, when they rode, they had oak stirrups, and then a piece of leather that covered the stirrups called un tapadera. And the shoe, since it's a soft leather shoe, would rub against that tapadera to prevent it from rubbing a hole in the shoe. They put this little bob. Okay? And then underneath this, they would wear the white pantalon de calzón. And then here you have your faja, your sash, and this is the traditional way that they would wear it. These are examples of spurs, and yes, they're very sharp and very long, and these were traditional for that time period. You had your hobbles. Just pull this back, slip it out, slip it back in. So this way your horse wouldn't go very far. Okay, so these are hobbles to keep your horse from wandering off. Then you have what's called the icama, better known in English as the hackamore. Braided leather, horsehair, reins here, and this would fit the horse. And this knot right here, if you notice there's a knot, leather knot, this will rub against a nerve that they have right here, so that when you want to go that way, you just pull your stirrups. So this is a traditional type of bridle used by the Vasqueros. So with that, I'll start my formal presentation. California India Vaqueros, the roots of an American icon. California Indians, Vaqueros, were the fiber that the roots of an American icon, the cowboy, was made of. What is so uniquely American than the cowboy? One might say that the cowboy is an international symbol of the United States. However, who came first, the American cowboy or the California Indian vaquero? Now let's see if I can make this thing cooperate. Good. Okay. Oh, well. Oh, the music came on. This song is some Chumash, right up here in Santa Barbara. Mike Lopez wrote this song for his grandfather, who was 100-year-old, one of the former vaqueros from the mission there at Santa Ynez. And I like it because it's all about his family. Okay, I'm going to turn that down and continue with my program here. I think I'm going to have to do this here. Okay. California Indians were instrumental in the development of the California cattle industry. Prior to the existence of the United States of America, California Indian vaqueros were learning their trade. As Joe Mora pointed out, vaqueros were present in California 80 years before the first Anglo-American cowboy appeared in the 1850s, and 100 years before Jesse Chisholm blazed the cattle trail that bears his name. From the founding of the first Spanish missions in San Diego in 1769 to the industrialization of California in the 1930s, California's primary industry was cattle. The contributions of the California Indian vaqueros have been overlooked and denied for too long, for they were among the very first Western American cowboys. In Spanish, cattle were called vacas, so a cattleman is a vaquero. When the future American cowboys arrived in California in the Southwest, they discovered a highly developed cattle culture already in place. The early American cowboys, in an effort to emulate the vaquero teachers, would refer to themselves as buckaroos, which is a mispronounced vaquero.
Oh.
Okay, let's. Oh. Let's see, there's
Just
one.
the
Cooperate
space
with me.
The space bar on there.
Excuse me?
The space bar.
Space bar. Oh, space bar. Okay. Now, the origins of the cattle industry. Cattle were present from the earliest contact between Spain and the Americas. Fray Bartolomé de las Casas notes that Columbus, in his second voyage in 1493, made a 2-day stop at the island of Groma, Canary Islands, in order to pick up cattle for the prospective colonies. The cattle herds multiplied on the island of Hispaniola at such a rapid rate, it instigated an Indian rebellion. On April 22nd, 1519, Cortés landed on Veracruz, and Tenochtitlan, Mexico City, surrendered to him in August of 1521. 2 individuals claimed the honor of bringing the first cattle to Mexico. Burham said that Diego de Ornas, in June of 1520, was sent by Cortés to Jamaica, or Jamaica, to secure cattle broods, calves, swine, sheep, chickens of the Spanish breed, and goats to multiply in the country for the province. Also claiming who brought the first cattle to Mexico in 1520 is Gregorio Villalobos. Who actually brought the first cattle to Mexico is unimportant. The point being that even Cortés, in the process of conquering the Mexica Tenoch, or the Aztecs at Tenochtitlan, he was laying the foundation for the cattle industry in the Americas. In a short amount of time, cattle were thriving on the mainland. The Central Mexican Plateau was the center of the early colonial cattle industry. By the time Antonio de Mendoza, the first viceroy of New Spain, arrived to take up his post in 1535, cattle, horses, and other grazing animals were a major industry. Viceroy Mendoza greatly encouraged the cattle industry with orders that, quote, all sailing ships from Spain to Veracruz bring European plants, seeds, and selected stock for breeding, unquote. The cattle industry's trek to Alta California was a mixture of exploratory expeditions, a succession of waves of Spanish missions, presidios, and settlements. Francisco Vasquez del Coronado, in 1541/42, marched north in search of the legendary 7 cities of Cibola and charted much of the northern frontier for Spain. The relationship between mines, missions, and presidios was essential in the mining companies for beef, hides, and tallow. The northern expansion took 3 routes. One route into Texas in order to stop the French from expanding beyond the Louisiana Territory. The second route was the inland to Santa Fe, New Mexico, founded in 1609. And the third along the Pacific coast. The Pacific slope of the northern Spanish frontier was the slowest route to be developed. Okay, I'm still at the same place. In 1687, Father Eusebio Quino advanced the Spanish realm to northern Sonora, and by 1695 sent cattle, sheep, goats, and other supplies to what is now present-day Arizona and Southern California. The next step was to settle Baja California. In February of 1697, a royal license was secured by the Jesuits to settle Baja California in the name of the king at their own expense. The stipulation by the crown at their own expense gave rise to the Fondo Palidoso de los Californias, better known as the Pious Fund. Created in 1697, the original fund for Baja California missions, it was later used to establish the Franciscan Alta California missions. So you have Baja California, and this part of California that's in the United States was called Alta California, or Upper California. Okay, when the first cattle arrived in Alta California is under debate. In 1769, Fernando Rivera headed for Alta California with 200 head of cattle, mostly cows and calves. The cattle were herded to Alta California by cavalrymen and arrieros, meaning muleers. On May 14th of 1769, Rivera arrived at San Diego with 123 full-grown animals, mostly cows, 41 male and female calves. The livestock was intended for the proposed mission at San Diego, San Carlos, and San Buenaventura. Rivera's arrival marked the first documented cattle in California, other than Quino in Southern California. Another claim was on January 9, 1769, the supply ship San Carlos left La Paz with 6 head of cattle and some horses. Unfortunately, there's no record of the cattle from the San Carlos arriving in Alta California. The cattle industry was a significant factor. Was a significant factor in the economic transformation of the missions, and the California Vaqueros were at the heart of that industry. So, in this debate, my personal feelings is the first person who really brought cattle to California was Eusebio Quino, and that was like in southeastern California, right around Yuma, right in that area, because he started the first missions at San Javier Bac, which is right outside of Tucson. Okay, brands, cattle law, and the cattle industry. The tradition of brands, or el fierro, to designate ownership of livestock goes back to the Iberian herdsman, as well as the cinal, or the individual ear-cutting designs. The Cibelo of Mexico registered 148 brands in 1531 for livestock owners in the Mexico City area. Laws dealing with cattle and small livestock made an early appearance in New Spain with the Viceroy Antonio de Mendoza, and based in the Mesa de España. There were 17 articles in the Mesa de Nueva España. Mesa would be like a table or a group or a meeting, a congress of people. The Mesa of New Spain had significant changes, one being that to act as a protective association for the livestock owners, and secondly, to settle petty livestock disputes. Okay, the livestock count and branding was usually performed at the rodeo or roundup for the metanza or the slaughtering around the end of December in Alta California. The count did not address the cattle cared for by the Indians and the one used for sustenance. San Buenaventura slaughtered 45 to 60 head of cattle weekly in 1813, and in times when the cattle were fat, 60 head twice a week. In June of 1820, it was estimated that San Juan Bautista slaughtered 2,600 cattle annually, and with the number increasing to 3,000 by 1821. And in 1826, Mission Santa Clara slaughtered 150 cattle weekly. Okay. Nope, I'm still in the same place. The Alta California ranchos were required to have 2 brands. One, el fierro para andar legamos, or the iron to brand the livestock. And the second brand was called el fierro para vender, or the iron for sale, used to cancel out the first brand in case of sale or transfer. During the rodeo, disputes would arise, and to settle them would be a juez de campo, or a field judge was appointed. The brand of the Jerónimo de Ruiz de Mota, registered in Mexico City in 1532, is a good example of the brand registered in New Spain, which is, I missed, okay, missed that one, okay. In Alta California, growth of the cattle industry was on the rise. California Indian Vaqueros were centered on the missions. When the pious fund was exhausted, the Padres transferred the mission system from a social-orientated institution dedicated to proselytization to a fundamental economic force for the military and civilian population. The source of the hostility between the fathers and the civilian population was control of the natural resources, this to participate in the lucrative hides and tallow trade. Okay, the crown granting free access to as much land as needed for the missions to endeavor, and the free access to native labor were the cornerstones of the mission's economic success. The mission fathers tried to stem the flow of new immigrants with unwanted social habits, which they felt were detrimental to the neophytes' spiritual growth. The method used by the fathers to stem immigration was to control land, which they justified by asserting the neophytes' ownership of the land in question and the fathers' fiduciary responsibility over the neophytes. It was the fathers' control of the resources that led to the widespread support for secularization by the non-mission population. At first, the fathers thought it would take 10 years to convert and teach and secularize the proposed missions in Alta California. However, the Franciscans did not want to give up the power the missions gave them, so Father Sir himself led the fight against secularization. Secularization is when they basically dissolve the missions and they appoint a secular priest to tend to it because they felt by that time they would become Spanish citizens. So that's what secularization meant, the end of the mission process, the beginning of a really secular community. On the other hand, the Mission Fathers' training of California Indians in the Vaquero trade was a tremendous success. The California Indians showed remarkable intelligence in learning the European trades, the skills in participating in them. The California Indian Vaquero was a hinge pin and the driving force that established the cattle industry in Alta California. Robert Freeman, a Luiseno Indian from the Rincon Reservation in San Diego County, once told me, quote, "Riding horses was one of the very few things that the Mission Fathers taught us that we really enjoyed," unquote. It was the use of neophytes' labor that illustrates the metamorphosis of the missions from a system of social and proselytization institution to a commercial one. During the prelude of secularization in the years between 1823 and 1834, Mission Indians, Mission Indians were heavily committed to the commercial market. Now we go to Indian Vaqueros, their trade horses and gear. The De Soto and Coronado expeditions of 1541 are credited as the source of the wild American herds or the Mustangs. The basic stock, which was the wild American herds of the Spanish mounts, came from what was known as the Arabian via Africa and the Moorish occupation of Spain. When non-neophyte California Indians first came in contact with the horse, they thought the horse was a marvelous animal, not as a pack or a riding animal, but as meat. Yes?
Are those paintings by Bob Freeman?
Oh yeah. These original paintings are Robert Freeman's drawings. Okay. Let's see. A horse was exotic meat, and horse stealing became a favorite sport. California Indians became vaqueros, and the Mission Fathers desired to teach animal husbandry and other European arts. The Mission Fathers were good teachers, and the demand for labor to tend to the ever-growing California herds resulted in a large number of Indian vaqueros. The Mission Fathers had to get around the laws of the Indies forbidding Indians from riding horses, sometimes upon the penalty of death. The California governor, Don Pedro Fajes, was against teaching the California Indians how to ride horses for fear that they would rebel against the Spanish like the Apaches did. The Mission Fathers justified the need to teach the California Indians how to ride horses by pointing out that there was no one else who tended to the growing mission herds. In the unfolding of history, it seemed the governor's fear was justified and later realized. So you can see right there, that's the Apaches who rebelled against the Spanish right there in the corner. Okay. Joe Mora said that, quote, the 65-year reign of the Mission Range Rider as the Mission Vaquero, quote, ended with the secularization with the zenith of the Mission Indians Vaqueros between 1786 and 1790. The California Indian Vaqueros drew their long tradition from the Indian Mestizo Vaqueros from earlier missionary activity throughout Latin America. The California Indian Vaquero came from the same tradition as the Vaqueros of Old Mexico, the Vaquero from Brazil, los Gauchos de Argentina, los Bulchos de Chile, and los Llaneros de Colombia y Venezuela. Remember, Joaquin Murrieta, a Chilean, and the Bandini family were also originally from Peru. By 1790, the fathers devoted much effort to bring skilled craftsmen to teach the neophytes various arts and trades. After the neophytes mastered the European arts and trades, the Indians started to experiment. The Indian artisans drifted away from the Spanish designs to incorporate their own designs, fauna, and flora in their work. This Indian expression gave birth to an art form later on known as Western art or Western style. Neophytes were chosen by the priests to participate at the presidio to learn various trades with the military's consent, such as ironworking and horseshoeing. Among the tradesmen recruited to Alta California were tabaladeros, or saddle makers. The first silla vaqueros, or saddles, were crude, yet with the guidance of the tabaladeros, imported from Old Mexico, they acquired a unique California style. The saddles in Mexico changed over a period of time depending upon the European wave that the individual came from. 250 years passed from the time Mexico was first conquered to when Alta California was settled. Within that time frame, there were various waves of immigrants that influenced colonial Latin America. The early Spanish conquistadores used a Moorish type of saddle which evolved into the longhorn saddle that was used by the colonial central and southern Mexico. By the time saddle making reached Alta California, the Persian style of saddle was used, modified for California. Although most Mexican saddles were basically the same, the difference being in the framing. The Persian style of saddle used a tree as a skeleton with a durable leather housing called a mochila. After a period of time, the saddle acquired a native California sabor, with the detached mochila becoming a permanent cover of heavy rawhide placed over the tree's frame. With coarse, heavy stitching, it exposed riggings and the stirrups leather arrezon, or loops, for the saddle bars. The whole affair had none of the smooth seats, says Joe Mora. Joe Mora has authentically illustrated the California Indian Vaqueros who were at the center of the highland talon trade in Alta California. Joe Mora, a vaquero, author, and artist who contributed to the history of the vaquero. Oh, come on. Okay. The saddle rested on a sudadero, or a sweat pad made of woven yucca fiber, as illustrated here in this picture. Another California trait that was stirrups made of carved oak with a semicircle cut in them for the toe to rest upon. The California riders characterized as toe riders. Over a period of time, the quality of the California Indian craftsmanship improved greatly, becoming highly prized and specifically requested by the best vaqueros. The Californian saddle was introduced to the Hawaiian Islands in 1808 by the Spanish and was in a high demand at the largest cattle ranch in Hawaii, the Parker Ranch. Another required tool of the vaquero was a leather braided rope, or the reata. The California vaquero became specifically adept at the use of the regata larga, or the long ropes ranging from 85 to 100 feet in length. To control the reata larga, the vaqueros deployed a very large loop before throwing it, and on windy days, little lead weights were attached to the reata. The two ends of the reata were called la hondo, and the other which formed the loop, and the cascabel, which formed the bell or the rattlesnake's tail, due to the braided appearance. So that's the loop, and then at the end, that's the cascabel right there. Luis Batista Ortega is a descendant of the old California Ortega family, renowned for his masterful work in braiding rawhide leather horse gear in the old California traditional style. The old Indian expert on the horse named Fernando Librado Ta Ortega. So here's Ortega, descendant of the old California family, and this is Fernando Librero, which to me, he's one of my heroes. He's Chumash, originally from the islands, but as a young man was taken to Mission Santa Barbara and later on here in Ventura. So this is very local here. Many in the field of California study know Fernando Librado as J.P. Harrington's most valuable informant on Chumash culture. This is the first time I heard of Fernando from a California context in the book The California Hackamore, an authentic story of the use of the hackamore, published in 1848 by Luis Ortega. And he said, quote, "I had often heard the buckaroo speak of Fernando Librado, the camp hook of the old Jalmala Rancho, who was well known for his braiding and the Indian buckskin he used to make. He was 110 years old at the time and no longer doing any heavy work of that type. Fernando, an Indian from the Tulare or the Chumash, had received his education from Santa Ynez Mission. The mission fathers had taught him the craft and the trade common in those days. So he knew how to tan leather and how to cure hides, but typically vaquero style. He had to pass any information on unless you took a fancy. Oh, he would not pass any information on to you unless he took a fancy to you. Even then, he was slow in giving out because he liked to see you learn it the hard way. He watched me try to fashion a piece of equipment to my crude way and gradually warmed up enough to begin to give me pointers on tempering the strands, making tools for preparing the materials, and etc. This was my first real instruction in preparing the curing hides and making a few braids and buttons," unquote. So the man most famous for the California attack owes it all to a Chumash Indian. And there's some more pictures of Fernando. And he's buried at Calvary Cemetery in Santa Barbara. I've been to his grave. Secularization of the missions eliminated the structure that the fathers had conditioned the neophytes for. Neophytes, on the collapse of the missions, were basically sent out to fend for themselves. There was a large number of unemployed California Indian vaqueros trained by the missions. In order to comprehend the magnitude and the extent of the cattle industry at that time, Mission San Luis Rey had 20 ranches scattered over more than 100 square leagues. Mission San Gabriel, a total of 17 ranches for raising cattle, horses, and 15 ranches for raising sheep, goats, and pigs. In the post-secularization period, California Indians were sought after by the gente de razón, or a person of reason, or a legally responsible person, for cheap, well-trained ranch hands. Especially after secularization, the civilian population received land grants and liberal access to native labor. When they said that the missions had these ranches, a lot of times they were called asistencias, or kind of like assistant sub-missions. So So those ranches were asistencias. Okay. Case studies. The case study of the California Indian Vaqueros are by no means the only ones. The first case study deals with Coquilla Chief Juan Antonio in the San Bernardino area. The second one addresses Juan Jesus that occurred mostly in the Central Valley, and the third at John Sutas Jalavita in Sacramento. The vaquero trade was for many California Indians provided the only means of survival and acceptance in the post-secularized California. Many ranches rooted in the tradition of the old Spanish Mexicano ranchos almost exclusively used California Indian vaqueros well into the U.S. Civil War. California Indians and Mexican vaqueros drove the first great herds to supply Oregon in 1836 by Irwin Young. The first great cattle drives from the south to the north occurred in California, from Southern California town counties to the gold rush miners in Northern California in 1850 before Jesse Chisholm. So the first real cattle drives from south to north occurred in California, not Jesse Chisholm. Indian vaqueros were well known at the famous Miller Lux ranches in Tejon Ranch, Kern County Land Company, and Rancho Santa Margarita up until it became Camp Pendleton Marine Base. And that was the original name. Camp Pendleton basically took over Rancho Santa Margarita. And I've met old vaqueros who used to work on Rancho Santa Margarita. Abel Stern married the Bandini family, married into the Bandini family in Southern California, and his rancho were rooted in the traditions of the Californios. Abel Stern became manager, and Jay Coots in the early 1850s was well known for solving many labor problems by going to rodeos and hiring Indian vaqueros from the local chief. After California's annexation into the United States, ranchers throughout California would solve their labor problems by going to the local jails or buying Indians cheaply. In fact, my professor at UC Davis in Native American Studies, Dr. Jack Forbes, he's actually documented that up until the 1850s, up until the 1880s, you were able to go to the livestock section of the LA market and buy Indians as late as 1880. Okay. The Coquillas were at the periphery of the mission influence, being recruited to Mission San Gabriel and San Luis Rey. The Coquillas already had a half-wild reputation among the Californios and, quote, for this reason they were eventually treated as allies by the Mexican authorities, who had scant respect for the pitiful neophytes of the already secularized missions, unquote. Juan Antonio ascended to the position of chief as a result of being appointed Capitan of the San Jacinto district of Mission San Luis Rey by the Mission Padres. After secularization, Juan Antonio and his Coquilla vaqueros formed an alliance with the Lugo family, moving to the village of Zacapa in the San Tomatillo Canyon around 1846, just south of present-day San Bernardino. 2 years earlier, in February 1844, Antonio Maria Lugo, in a letter, mentioned how the Coquilla warriors had fought off and ran off a group of horse and livestock stealing Indians. Okay, there we go. The Coquilla vaqueros, under Juan Antonio's guidance, served the Lugo family for many years, guarding the Lugo problem-plagued Rancho San Bernardino. One day, Juan Antonio performed his job all too well by confronting the famous outlaw John, quote, Red Irving and his gang. John Red Irving and 12 of his men in late May of 1851 raided the San Bernardino Lugo home, while Jose de Lugo was out on the range. When Juan Lugo learned of the raid, he dispatched a rider to call for help from Juan Antonio and his Vasqueros. Juan Antonio mobilized his Vasqueros upon learning the information and set out to the Lugo home. Juan Antonio and his Vasqueros arrived at the Lugo home just as the Irving gang were making their departure and gave chase. The 12 members of the Irving family were greatly outnumbered, chased by the 60 Indian Vasqueros into the Yucapa hills. A fire volley at the Indians pursuing. Several times the Irving gang was forced to dismount. Eventually, the incident ended with the death of the entire Irving gang by arrow attack. The Coquilla Vaqueros were armed only with arrows and knives. Okay. Even though the Anglos were greatly relieved to rid themselves of the notorious Irving gang, many Anglos were outraged, especially General Bean, that an Indian had killed a white man, even if the white man was an outlaw. Hostile feelings among the Anglos became so embittered that a rumor reached Juan Antonio that, quote, 200 men were on the way from Los Angeles with military to take vengeance on the Indians for having killed a white man, unquote. This rumor sent Juan Antonio and his villagers into the mountains for fear of reprisal. On June of 1851, a statement was published in the newspaper, the Los Angeles Star, and the coroner requested absolution of the Coquilla leader. Juan Antonio captured and turned over to the U.S. authorities Chief Juan Antonio, who led the 1851 Indian tax revolt against the United States. The U.S. authorities after the Garra revolt did not want any strong Indian leaders, so they stripped Juan Antonio of his powers. The smallpox epidemic of 1863 took away Juan Antonio's life, but the California Indian Vaqueros continued in their work. The Antonio Garra revolt to me is so fascinating. And to think that after California was annexed into the United States, some California Indians were rebelling against the United States for taxation without representation and failure of due process in the judicial system. So here you had California Indians fighting the U.S. for very American principles. Okay. The second case deals with the Central Valley. Jose Jesus, the Yokut leader, was educated at Mission Santa Clara and San Jose, where he became an alcalde, which is like for lack of a better word, a chief or leader in the mission community. Mission life proved too tame for Jose Jesus, so he joined forces with the famous Yokut leader, Stanislaw, or Stanislaus as the Yankees would call him. Stanislaw was wise in choosing his lieutenants, who later became distinguished leaders in their own right, such as Cipriano from Mission Santa Clara, Yacuzo, a Yokut from the Mission San Jose, and Jose Jesus himself. Escaping into the Central Valley to seek freedom from the missions, the runaway neophytes tried to reestablish their own communities. There were many villages of runaway mission Indians in the Central Valley at that time. In 1823 to 1829, 3 Spanish military expeditions were sent to bring Stanislao's group back into the missions and failed. Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo was a young man then, and he made his name as an Indian fighter throughout this campaign. After Stanislao resisted 3 Spanish attacks, a large contingent of 100 soldiers was organized at Mission San Francisco. Led by the alcalde Mauricio, 50 Christian Indians who were traditional enemies of the Yokuts complemented the armed contingent that forced the rebellious Indians back into the missions. So this is General Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo, or Vallejo as many people call him now. Jose Jesus and his followers were recent arrivals to the missions when they were secularized. Returning to their village communities, like they had planned at the time of the Stanislaus revolt, Jose Jesus became known as the Christian horse thief because of his mission past and his occupation or hobby of stealing or raiding the coastal ranches. Jose Jesus would trade his stolen horses and cattle with the Comancheros coming out of New Mexico. Later, Suter recruited Jose Jesus and his men as trained vaqueros. And I pronounced his name the way he pronounced his name. Americans call him Sutter. He's not Sutter. He pronounced his name Sutter. S-U-T-T-E-R. His name was Sutter. The last case, did we? Okay, here we go. The last case of the post-secularized Indian vaqueros took place at New Halavita. The Swiss-German immigrant John Suter, to develop his dream settlement in New Halavita, actively recruited mission-trained California Indian labor, especially vaqueros. Suter maintained a private army of California Indians dressed in uniforms purchased from the Russians at Fort Ross. Famous among Suter's army was his elite personal guard called the Lanceros, or the Lancers. Suter came to the European tradition where Lancers were an integral part of a cavalryman's outfit. Suter never went anywhere without his Lancero personal guard, all trained and experienced vaqueros, fully armed. So when the Russians were pulling out of Fort Ross, they sold everything to Suter, including the Russian uniforms. So he dressed up the California Indians in Russian uniforms, armed them, and made them his personal guard. And like I said, they would have these long lances, the lanceros. So everywhere he went, they would have these lances with these little flags flying on them. Fremont, during the Bear Flag Revolt, commandeered New Halavita, renaming it Fort Sacramento, and took command of Sutter's Indian garrison, placing Lieutenant Edward Kern over them. Under U.S. authority, 50 California Indians volunteered for the U.S. Army. 30 Indian soldiers was the minimum number of men needed to maintain a permanent guard at the fort, so Commodore Stockton retained this arrangement. Lieutenant Kern later enlisted 20 Californian vaqueros as cavalrymen, justifying the action by describing them as hunters. However, the payroll in 1846 of August identified the California Indians as cavalry troops enlisted. Suter was later commissioned as a lieutenant and certified, and Lieutenant Kern certified the payroll. So here you had, what's happening here? So here you had California Indians actually fighting for the United States. And yeah, here we go. There are many more stories of California Indian vaqueros waiting to be discovered, for the history of California Indian vaquero lives on. My conclusion: California Indian vaqueros, or cattlemen, are still working throughout California today. Coming from a long, deep cattle tradition from Latin America, California Indian vaqueros established the cattle industry in the state of California, helped to stock the first great herds in Oregon, Hawaii, and other points west. The California Indians, like their counterparts throughout Latin America, taught the Western American cowboy his trade, including the terminology and customs that lie at the heart of the Western American cowboy tradition. The contributions made by California Indians to the cattle industry, the lore of Western Americana, and the heritage of the United States has been overlooked for too long, for the California Indian vaqueros were among the very first Western American cowboys and the roots of an American icon. So, now, that's kind of like the end of my little formal thing here. So I'm going to punch up here. This is Mike Lopez's grandfather that he wrote the song for. So He was 100 years old when he died. That's Mike Lopez, who created this song for his grandfather. And this here is Fernando Librado. This is the Tomal boat that he made for J.P. Harrington that you could see right now if you go to the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History. And this is when I went to his grave at Calvary Cemetery. Now what's interesting is when Fernando Librado made his Tomal, he carved a round hole at the bow. And Huntington asked him what was that for. And he said something like it was like a compass. And Harrington goes, like a compass? He just didn't know what it was. Well, about 20 years ago or more, I was at the California Indian Conference. And there was a woman who had an extensive background in Polynesian star maps, you know, the ones that you could hold up, you know, that was guided through the ocean. So she was going through the Chumash collection, and she saw these things that were called, that they had identified as like sunstones. She looks at them and she goes, that's not a sunstone. And she figured it out. It was the Chumash compass, and this is how they were able to maneuver through the fog. It was round and it had radiating lines. And what they would do is, when they're offshore, they would, when they find a fixed point in the fog, they would align it so that that line is at that fixed point. Once they have that, then they know if they follow this line, they're going to that village. If they follow this line, they're going to that village. If they follow this line, they're going to that village. If they follow this line, they're going to that village. And that's how they were able to maneuver through the fog. The Chumash were extremely advanced. They had a calendar system that they would realign every 5 years, and when they realigned it, they would gather at what is now the Ventura Fairgrounds, because it was, at that time, just a large, open beach area. When they had these big times, and when they would realign the calendar, they would also be at trading missions. Indians from Northern California, Indians from Arizona, Indians from Mexico came here to trade in those times. So Fernando Librado is, to me, and actually his name, Librado, means the book. That wasn't his real name. That was a given name because he was like a walking book. He knew so. He actually went back and talked to the elders before they died to learn all about the old ways, the old ceremonies, and everything. He was a walking book, Fernando Librado. Now, this here, Chief Juan Antonio that I spoke about, this was his brand. As you can see, A and J, Juan Antonio. So this is a California Indian Vaquero brand from the 1840s and 50s. It's right now being held at the Riverside Municipal Museum. The Vaquero tradition among the California Indians is still going strong. I went to the Morongo Indian Reservation, but they had the Indian Cowboy Rodeo. So they're still doing it today, including a lot of women vaqueras. Yay! And I'm a retired California State Park Ranger. That's when I was on Alcatraz as a National Park Ranger. And this is me right here doing mountain law enforcement at Mount Diablo State Park as a California State Park Ranger peace officer. So I'm also an equestrian. So it's, for me, it's not just intellectual or cerebral. I actually rode the horse and ran the entire horse program Horse Patrol Private Patrolman at Mount Diablo State Park. So, questions? Yes, ma'am.
A few years, more than a few years ago, a while back, my husband and I visited Oregon. And from there, we went across the Columbia over to the Washington side, where they have a museum, and gosh, I forgot the
The
name.
High Desert Museum?
There's, it's an Indian museum. They have art, they have writing, they have students come in, and they had apparently there were villages along the Columbia, and then they show the art. But then the students come in and they wrote letters, and they had history. And I'm wondering, you mentioned Oregon. Do you know of this museum up near Columbia? It's the,
The most well-known one.
on the Washington side. So you have the Washington side on one side of the river, and you have, of course, Oregon on
Like the one I mostly know is the High Desert Museum there in Oregon. They're really, in fact,
That's what I was wondering.
in fact, one time when I was a park ranger at Mount Diablo State Park, they were doing an exhibit on Vasqueros, and they came down and took pictures of me in my traje. Okay, that's not a costume, it's a traje. And on my horse doing Vaquero stuff. Yes, ma'am.
How long did it take you to gather all this history and information?
Oh, I've been into this for many, many years. I started doing the actual research when I was doing my doctoral coursework at Berkeley. So, yeah, that's when I really started doing it seriously. But like I said, I've always been an equestrian. Ever since I was a little kid. My great grandmother had a ranch in the Sacramento Valley, and I used to play with horses there as a young child. So I've always been around horses.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
Aku Pichichampi ke Ekidipich Katirena Kapana Shumalok sa Atitol. Good morning, friends. My name is Reina, and I'm a Chumash native from the village of Sadikoy, and I live here in Port Hueneme, and I just wanted to say thank you for coming out.
Wonderful.
I actually got to be part of the, when we launched out of Tulimu, Santa Cruz, we launched the Tumol, at night at 2 in the morning. So that was my first time going out there, but I started my journey, I think it was last year. So always growing up, being born and raised in Ventura and Saticoy, delivered by my great aunt. I'm part of the Ortegas, the long lineage, also the Lopez, the Spaniard side. And so I just started my journey. It's been very interesting. I've been a certified California naturalist through our village out in Malibu, Wichita. And I just want to say thank you. I actually, starting the journey, I stepped up to be part of the special emphasis program. I work at the base here at NAPC. So I stepped up because we didn't have any representation there. So I'm always looking for speakers and for people that want to come and speak on behalf of the native.
We watch you. We watch you here.
Yeah, so it's been an interesting, journey. I actually gave medicine once at the Sweat Lodge in Ventura, and I really was totally unaware, but because it was my ancestral village, they honored me with giving the medicine, and I didn't realize how powerful healing, you're basically the healer, but it really got me closer to my ancestry, to my heritage, and I just want to thank you for coming out here. I look at my ancestry and I'm like, I think it's 46% Native and the other like 34% or 40% Spanish. So growing up and always being told, oh, you're from Mexico, and it's like, how can I be from Mexico when I've never been to Mexico? I mean, I'm not fluent in Spanish, but to me, I'm sure I have ancestors from Mexico. But the Native side and the Spaniard side is really all I've ever known. So, but you touch me, you're very close to what you're saying, I can feel it, so I just want to say thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, we used to live in El Rio.
Yeah.
And at one time I worked for the California Indian Health Council, and I was interviewing natives about their health care. And you're right. And Satokui,
Yeah,
And El Rio,
yeah.
a lot of Chumash people live in that area because they're so old community. In fact, if I remember correctly, I think even Satacuy is mentioned in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo because it's such an old community.
Yeah, we actually, right now, I have to be very careful with what I say, but we just acquired the Santa Paula Golf Course, and we're gonna restore it back to its natural environment. It's not gonna be a golf course, but we've had those river rights that run through from Santa Paula to Satacoy. I mean, my mom was just talking about, playing in the river, and I remember that too as a child. But it's a long familial history with the adobes, the Reyes and the Olivas adobes and Ortega Street. I mean, our family goes way back. So I kind of will say this, the Mexican tradition, I like how the children take the mother's name. Because my birth name is Reina Vaca,
Do you know why?
because I'm the queen of the Vaqueros. No, I'm
Well, here, most Mexican men do have their mother's maiden name as their middle name
yeah,
because in Mexican Spanish law, women were able to hold land in their own names.
yeah.
They lost that right when the U.S. annexed California. So the reason why Mexican men have their mother's maiden name as their middle name is so they can lay claim to their mother's property when she dies.
I just figured the mother carries the child, she should have the honor, And since my father left when I was 2,
Yeah.
come to find out, my last name wasn't even Vaca, it was Villaseñor. And I'm like, what? Who am I?
I know Villaseñor.
Yeah.
He was a great scholar. He's now passed away, but he did some great books for Naturegraph publications on native philosophy and history. I would look it up too. But now, at my personal family, I think the DNA came back at we're 86.5% American Indian, and because me hablo español, sin acento de inglés.
Yeah.
People go, are you Mexican or are you Indian? And I say, well, yes.
I think the
What's the difference?
Yeah.
Here's a good statistic that most people don't realize.
Yeah.
You got all the Indians in the United States, all the Indians in Canada, and you put them together, you have what? 3.5 million Indians maybe? In North, Central, and South America, there's 60 million Indians. 30 million Indians live in the country of Mexico. That means half of all the Indians that live in this hemisphere live in the country of Mexico. And 2 men really influenced me. One is my academic advisor, Dr. Jack Ford at UC Berkeley. And another one is Dr. Paredes from UNAM, the University of Mexico City, the National University. Both men have the same perspective, and that is there's no North, Central, or South America. From an indigenous perspective, there's only one continent. And Dr. Paredes, what he did was he studied the roots of the Uto-Athabascan language, which goes all the way from Alaska, Canada, throughout the United States, down into Mexico, and that's the basic root language that the Aztecs spoke. He studied the language of the Quichua Maya, and he studied the language of the Quechua in the Andes area, South America. And his perspective was not one culture or language was the mother to the other 2, but all 3 languages came from one mother culture. And he published it in a book called Una Continente, Una Cultura, one continent, one culture. And Dr. John Ford said that the Mexican Gulf is our Mediterranean. So looking at it from an indigenous perspective, there's only one continent, Turtle Island. Although Amerigo Vespucci got dibs on the name from the Western perspective. Yes, ma'am.
It sounds like the area almost became French at what particular time. It was like where there was like a kind of a crossover. It sounds what you said that the Vaqueros helped to help the U.S. soldiers to separate, to keep it the way, the way it was, but it sounds like we were very close at one particular time being taken over by the French.
Well,
We
the
would
French
have
were
been
in the
speaking
Louisiana
French.
territory.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
that was the reason why, like I said, they set up Santa Fe, was to prevent the French from going any further, west. And so, there was some, actually where there was more influence and interbreeding, I guess you might call it, was actually more in the Canadian area where my wife's from.
I'm just surprised that when you mentioned Russian. I was thinking to myself.
Well, the Russians had,
how on
in
earth?
fact,
Vodka.
what I find was
They
really
brought
interesting,
vodka.
because, the Russians had Fort Ross. What the Pomos used to call the Russians they were the underwater people. You know why they called them the underwater people? Due to the curvature of the earth, when a ship is coming, you first see the masts, and then you see the ship. It looks as if they're coming from under the water. So that's why they called the Russians the underwater people. And the only reason why the Russians were here is because they had their colonies up in like Sitka and all around there. And they needed, to supply them was too hard to come from St. Petersburg. So they were looking for an agricultural colony close by. They tried to set one up in the panhandle of Alaska and Washington. But what happened was the natives wouldn't let them get past the coast. The natives just, you guys stay there. So they couldn't grow anything at the coast. So they had to come to California. And that was the intent of Fort Ross. Now, because of the bad relationships the Russians had with the natives in Alaska and Washington, they took a different approach in California, where they actually hired the Indians and paid them a wage. And they made treaties with the local chiefs. The local chiefs would have a medal, which on one side would have the Imperial Russian eagle, and on the back side it would say, Friends of Russia. And any Indian wearing that medal had free access in and out of Fort Ross, unabated, because he was a friend of Russia. He had the Imperial eagle.
Any more questions?
This is an appreciation for speaking.
Oh,
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you.
You're welcome. And we pass the hat because we don't receive any funding. And those that are going on the White House tour, he's out there waiting, so you have some time.